Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders, and this is the podcast where you start back at episode 1, get all those great episodes. I love hearing stories about people going back to the beginning, changing their life, getting all the great information, sharing with the family, sharing with friends, giving a review on iTunes, other podcast apps, all the good stuff that's for free. I don't have any sponsors yet. That might change soon. So please do what you can to support this podcast, all the free ways I just mentioned. You can also support me on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/peakhuman, throw in a few bucks a month there. You can get the extended show notes. You can support the show. You can get some private content I have there just for subscribers. It would be a big help. You can also go to sapien.org, check out our program. We have the Sapien Tribe. We have the Sapien Program. You can get more information on how to be healthy, how to change your life, how to avoid chronic disease. We have a 12-week class with Dr. Gary. We also have the Tribe where we have our private community. We also have Nose to Tail. This is my own company. It's great ranchers here in Texas that raise the meat in the best way possible, regenerative methods, wild crafted, diverse diets, all the best ways to raise the animals without pesticides, without hormones, antibiotics. It's a good diet without corn and soy in the chicken, the pig feed, pasture raised, everything, all the buzzwords. We got it all. We have the primal ground beef that's changing to nose to tail beef. We're going to call it nose to tail beef now because it has the organs. It has liver, heart, kidney, and spleen. The stuff is so good. I just made a gigantic pizza-sized patty for people who came over to my barbecue here in Austin, and everyone loved it. You can't taste the organ meats. It's delicious. It gets all the nutrients that aren't in the muscle meats, and I can't recommend it enough. Check out all our products. Biltong, Drovors, this is the dried meat. This stuff is so good. Nothing of it complements. Best way to have protein on the go. It's the cleanest product. There's no preservatives. There's no sugar. There's none of that stuff. Not even nitrates, none of it. It's just vinegar and some seasoning. This is how traditionally people did it in South Africa. It's air dried for a long period instead of a high heat for a short period, which is dehydration, which is normal jerky. So this stuff is softer, it's better, it's delicious. Order it now. We have the Livervores, which has liver mixed in. So that's in a stick format, which is great. You can chew on these sticks, get all the nutrition in a really convenient package. Also the body care, pretty much sold out. Still really trying to get our big order in so we can accommodate everyone. I know everyone loves that stuff and it sells out so quickly. I think it's about 30 days away, but check back. We might have some smaller batches available between then. We also got our great seasonings on the site, nosetotale.org. I use these every day. I always put the primal special on the primal ground beef, which is nose to tail ground beef now. You can put the dill and ranch on sour cream or Greek yogurt and make the most amazing ranch sauce without soybean oil, the healthiest ranch sauce you can get. Just a few seasonings and spices, freshly ground. We do it all the right way. nosetotale.org. Get it while you can. And now on to my guest today, Dr. Michael Ruscio. He's the man. He's here in Austin. He's a doctor of natural medicine, doctor of chiropractic. He's a clinical researcher and author. His work has been published in peer-reviewed medical journals, and he's a committee member of the Naturopathic Board of Gastroenterology Research Division. We met here in Austin. We did the podcast virtually, though. We're probably going to do another one in person with his setup because I don't really have a mobile setup. I just have my studio here. We cover a lot of the gut health stuff. I haven't covered this as much as I wanted to, so this was a good intro to that. We want to go deeper next one. I think he has some great ideas. He is a bit general and inclusive in what he was talking about, which is a good thing. You know, I don't want to get caught in a dietary camp, so that was good, but you know, maybe next time we can challenge him more on certain anti-nutrients, grains, stuff like that, because I know he is interested in gluten-free diets, stuff like that. But in this episode, he kind of was very soft on gluten and was kind of mentioning broad research. And so I asked him, I thought we were challenging the research. You know, this nutrition research isn't always done well. So anyway, check this one out, and we'll dive in more on a second episode. And I look forward to any comments and suggestions, and maybe I can challenge him more on some of these things. So thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing with a friend, giving a review on iTunes, checking out nosetotale.org, going to sapien.org. And here is Dr. Michael Ruscio. Hey, we're live with Dr. Michael Ruscio. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm sad that we're not doing this in person because we're both in Austin. I didn't even ask you what part of town you're in.
I know this is one of the few that we probably could have done in person because, you know, so many people are not in Austin. It's not a high percentage of interviews are actually in town with you, but maybe the next one we'll do face to face.
Yeah.
And
Well, we'll have to
I'm in the
connect.
Travis Heights area, so that's where
Okay.
I'm hiding out.
Well, we'll have some events we'll go to, I'm sure, in the near future and hang out in person again. We met at an event, a mastermind here in Austin, and I know you have a book called Healthy Gut, Healthy You, and I know that you're on my pal Dr. Paul Saladino's show a while back that I listened to. So let's talk some gut health and microbiome and all that stuff.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, so this is sad. This is the sad thing. Usually I'm a better podcast host and I always read my guest book, but I couldn't get to it in time. Maybe you could start with a little bit of background on yourself and a high level look at your book and your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in college, wanted to go into medicine, was on par rather to go into conventional medicine. And my sophomore year, I started having very bad brain fog, food reactive brain fog, depression, crippling insomnia, and I couldn't figure out why. And I before that was a very healthy college athlete. You know, you're what, 22, feeling like you're invincible, right? Can do anything and not really feel much of a difference, to just having these bouts of where I felt like I couldn't think and I had mood dips and low energy and couldn't sleep and blah blah blah. Turns out I had an intestinal parasite. Took about 6 months to figure it out, because after I went to a number of conventional doctors, they all said, well, cholesterol looks good. There's no anemia, right? Like the standard kind of blood work, and legitimately trying to look for any problem, but there was nothing that they found. And because I looked healthy, meaning I wasn't, let's say, overweight or had elevated blood sugar, nothing really flagged for them. There was no hypothyroidism. And it wasn't until I went to the functional and alternative health camp, I found functional medicine, and a doctor posed the idea that I might have a parasite. And I thought he was crazy. I think to myself, well, I haven't gone to Mexico and got food poisoning and have diarrhea all the time. I have no digestive symptoms, which is, I think, a key lesson. You can have a problem in the gut without any overt gastrointestinal symptoms. So in my case, there was a lot of leaky gut and inflammation in the intestines, but it was only manifesting as brain fog, depression, fatigue, and insomnia. So it took me a little while to figure that all out, and that diverted my path into integrative and functional medicine, which has been a great field to be in. However, residing in this field, it's disturbing to see there's a fair amount of dogma, especially around diet. There's all these camps that kind of argue with one another: vegan versus paleo versus high carb versus low carb versus low lectin. You know, there's all these um, camps that argue, and unfortunately I feel like patients are kind of stuck in the middle, and they're not getting this practical, evidence-based but not snarky kind of if you don't have a large drug funded clinical trial, we're going to look down on your science like it's inferior science perspective. And that's what we're doing now, both in my clinic, which is a multi-doctor clinic with a dedicated research team, but also with the book Healthy Gut, Healthy You, was just trying to give people a responsible narrative on improving their gut health, and to bring in one of our mutual friends, Paul Saladino. Something like the carnivore diet is helpful, especially when people have unhealthy digestive tracts, because it turns out that for many people, digesting, especially raw plant foods, can be some of the most challenging foods to digest. And so a carnivore diet is, in a way, almost like the most extreme elimination diet to help people heal their guts. And we'll see a subset of people who've gone on that type of elimination diet and it's helped, but they want to be able to eat other foods. And so they'll stop in and visit us to try to tune up their gut health so they have better dietary tolerance. So that's kind of the long short, with a few other side remarks peppered in.
Well, I love that. Yeah, I've always been kind of fascinated by the carnivore diet, but I've never advocated for it as like a thing that we should do. And I would kind of argue with Paul back in the day because I've known him for many years, and I was always telling him, yeah, let's add in more foods, and he was like, no. And now he's on the honey and fruit train, so he actually did finally take his that path and add some more foods in. But still, I was telling him about, like, I eat sauerkraut and kimchi and probiotic rich foods like that. And, I think that helps lower the the anti-nutrients and help the digestibility and all this good stuff. And he was saying, no, 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 that's bad. And I don't know, I guess he still doesn't eat that stuff now. But yeah, I think the ultimate goal is to have a, a gut that can digest the most amount of foods, but healthy foods.
Exactly. And that's what I think most people want, right? Most people, they care about being able to eat a wide array of foods and still be healthy. And yeah, I don't think it's a tenable argument to say we should be carnivore, nor do I think it's a tenable argument to say we can be vegan. I think the most substantial body of evidence looking at our hunter-gatherer past clearly supports us being omnivorous and not at one polar extreme. So I'm right there with you. And then I think my job and a good clinician's job is to help the person. Let's say philosophically they want to be on XYZ diet. We can at least help them get to a point where they can thrive on that diet. Whether or not I fully agree with it or not, that's not necessarily what we're trying to do at the clinic. We're just trying to help people, again, to your point, be able to thrive on the widest array of foods, so they don't feel like they're backed into a corner every time they go out or are traveling. They feel like it's going to be really hard to live because their food list is just so narrow.
Exactly. So what do you regard as foods that they should try to avoid no matter what, though? Because I do like this idea of, not feeling like super restricted. And I do go out with friends and I can eat more variety of foods and I'm fine. Actually, I told this to Paul that because I expand my diet and my gut microbiome has all the right species, supposedly, I can digest all types of foods. So when I do go out, it's fine. I'm totally fine. I just don't want to eat those foods all the time. But yeah, do you have like a certain list of foods that you'd rather not people eat all the time?
Well, I think the paleo diet provides a pretty good framework for, foods that we should be somewhat avoidant of. Grains can be problematic for some people, although all grains aren't created equal. I would say rice seems to be way more tolerated and helpful for people than could be gluten. But even gluten, if you look at some of the best evidence on this, it clocks in at maybe a 3% prevalence. Some estimates are a little higher, some estimates are a little bit lower, but probably a 3% is where you're seeing, if you sum up all the different data points, 3% of the population has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So even something like gluten, which is oftentimes vilified, I don't think we can make the case everyone has to avoid gluten all the time. And I think that's a bit of an overreach. Dairy can be a problem for some. So grains, within the grains, gluten probably most problematic. Dairy for some. And I should probably back up and say things that are processed, right? The highly processed foods that have the added, either if it's rancid fats or trans fats or hydrogenated oils or industrial seed oils or sugar or emulsifiers, or even artificial sweeteners in a lot of cases. Probably basic, probably everyone in your audience already knows that, but I think that's kind of the first checkbox to tick. And then from there, you get into kind of the, okay, let's think about dairy, grains. But then for some people, ironically, if they eat too much vegetables, they notice they feel worse. And this is where something like a low FODMAP diet, I think, is one move that you can deploy. Carnivore will also work, but I think it's overkill for a lot of people. And if they maybe just went on a lower FODMAP diet, they'd see some of the same improvements. But we couldn't make an argument that asparagus, and so FODMAP, just to clarify, these are foods high in these are foods high in prebiotics that feed the gut microbiota. So from a stereotype perspective, you'd be saying, well, don't we want lots of these? Don't we want lots of prebiotics which feed our intestinal bacteria, which promote health in the microbiota? And it's not quite that simple because the gut ecosystem is quite complex. And it's not just saying, well, if we feed bacteria, more bacteria, better. It's not exactly how the gut works. There's this other part of the gut called the immune system. And if you feed the microbiota too much, that can trigger the immune system to sort of go through its pruning process. And this is why you'll see in clinical trials where people reduce the amount of FODMAP foods, which are healthy or seemingly healthy, they will see less leaky gut less inflammation, less bloating, less diarrhea, less constipation when reducing things like broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, a lot of the high sulfur, high sulforaphane, and brassica family foods that are health promoting, like broccoli, right? That's a lot of health benefits associated to broccoli. But in those with sensitive digestion, this family of foods that are higher FODMAP can actually be making them worse. It's not to say they have to avoid them forever, but a short-term reduction in the level of those foods can be quite helpful for people in the matter of 1 or 2 weeks. And you maybe stay on this diet for a couple months and then reintroduce foods. It's almost like doing a rehab plan for a shoulder that was sore because of the rotator cuff muscles got out of balance. So you get yourself back in balance, and then you can do your normal activity day over day without any pain or dysfunction. Similar sort of concept with the low FODMAP diet. So that's just one example of a few. But I would say a paleo framework, which obviously cuts out grains and dairy. And secondary to that, a low FODMAP is probably going to be, those two different dietary changes will probably yield the most benefits for the highest number of people.
I like that. Yeah, I'm in line with that. You could go deeper. I mean, I am a fan of animal-based diets in general, and just getting most of our nutrition from animals. I think before we started recording, we briefly talked about the ancestral lens, right, of all diets, where this should be a huge thing that we look at. We're looking at millions of years of pre-humans and then 300,000 years, I guess, of Homo sapiens. And, we're in this lens of like 100 years that we're like basing all our ideas off of all food. And man, I absolutely think we didn't have a lot of these cruciferous vegetables. The ones you mentioned,
right?
Those weren't around that long ago. Exactly. And so, even like soy, there's so many more. What about soy, nightshades, high oxalate foods? What are your opinions on those?
The oxalates. So zooming way out, you get the further you go down the road of dietary restriction, the less yield you tend to get. And I say that as a clinician who really tries to set up these experiments where you isolate for whatever change the dietary protocol is calling for. One example is the low lectin diet. It's really not as helpful as it's often portrayed to be. Now, it's not because when people go on that diet, they don't see improvements. But when you isolate for just the lectins themselves, that doesn't tend to be very helpful, nor is there much evidence supporting that. Now, when people go on the low lectin diet, they also cut out many inflammatory foods like grains and processed foods. So it's almost like saying someone goes gluten-free and they feel better, but it's not necessarily because they went gluten-free. It's because they were eating a whole bunch of processed grains and they cut all of that out when they went gluten-free, and they started having more meats and fish and vegetables. Do you see what I'm saying? So we can't really say, well, it's because of the gluten. That one change spawned other healthy changes. So with oxalates, with lectins, salicylates, same thing. I can't really say that those have been helpful. Low FODMAP, there's a clear signal of benefit there. Low histamine to some degree, although the signal is more faint. And low histamine has applicability because, especially when you're in the lower carb sort of ancestral camp, you end up having more high histamine foods in the diet. Anything fermented is going to be high histamine, as will any sort of cured meats or canned foods, or avocados and spinach. So, when you start going into this, I kind of call it the lazy man's paleo, right? You have like jerky and tuna and maybe some smoked salmon and avocado and some spinach and some
salami,
kimchi, sauerkraut. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of actually quite healthy foods that are convenient to eat, but they're all also high in histamine. And these are the people who will be doing a paleo-like protocol normally on the lower carb side and complaining of anxiousness, brain fog, irritability, runny nose, flushing, insomnia are some of the more typical symptoms. So I guess the way I look at this is not so much through the frame of what's the healthiest human diet. That is the background I approach this from, which is the ancestral frame. But for me in the clinic, I have that frame already. And then it's okay, when someone comes in and they're suffering with loose bowels and bloating, and they're eating this really healthy paleo diet with tons of vegetables, low FODMAP is probably going to be for them. When it's the CrossFitter who's doing kind of this quasi keto, low carb paleo diet, and he's having a ton of high histamine foods in his diet, and he's wondering why is he irritable all the time and doesn't sleep well, it might be that he's too low carb metabolically, or it might be that he's high histamine. So sorry if I'm not giving you sort of like the square answer, but most of what I do day over day is really just looking at different cases coming in and trying to figure out how do we fine tune their diet, usually within the ancestral framework, right? But that's kind of broad. So, within that framework, are we trying to pivot to the direction of low FODMAP, low histamine, in some cases carnivore, when they've kind of already gone on all these diets? They come in, they're gluten-free, dairy-free, low carb, low histamine, then they went carnivore and they're feeling a little bit better, but now they're wondering, what do I do? Because this is not a tenable diet in the long term, and I want to be able to have a life. So that's a lot of kind of what we see come in, and then how we're trying to use these tools to get people to a point where they have a broader diet that they can thrive on.
Well, no, your answer is correct, because, well, you're a clinician and you see all the different people, and you can't I hate saying there's no one size fits all diet because it's such a stupid term that people use all the time, but it is true.
Right.
Because, man, even I'm thinking of my crowd, and I'm trying to be camp, no camp, right? That's what I strive for, right? Camp, no camp. My camp, I'll say it again. I think I've been saying it on my podcast recently. My camp is animal foods are good, processed foods are bad. That's about it. Like I try to not have more of a camp than that, right? Which is a pretty safe camp to be in, right? That's just the most basic general knowledge that we've known for all of history. So, but then within that, but within that, there's completely opposite cases. Like you said, someone could come in and they're doing very well with all kinds of plant foods, and some people you need to cut out those plant foods. So that's why, I mean, even in Instagram or something, where I get a lot of feedback, and then people will be saying the exact opposite things, and giving people opposite advice, or saying this is the opposite opinion. Or I posted a photo with meat, and I had a whole dish and it had pickles involved, and people were like, "Oh, that looks good, except get rid of the green stuff." I'm like, "Oh man, we're complaining about pickles? Like, this is not a good place to be in."
Well, I mean, this comes back to my initial point of one of the things about the field that I don't like is how it's gotten so guru and sort of fad driven, right? You have the vegan doctor, the carnivore doctor, the gluten-free doctor, the paleo doctor, or guru or author or influencer. And all of that likely comes from a good place, right? I'm not saying any of those people are like, oh, I'm in cahoots with the food companies and trying to make money. But I think the challenge with that is what ends up happening is, let's say you're someone who would do better on a higher carb diet. There are some people that fit this bill, athletes, more so women, definitely. They might be reading about keto gurus stuff and reading in the message board, oh man, this helped me so much. This helped my friend so much. And then they try it and it doesn't feel good to them. But then they'll read, oh, you got to keep going. You'll peel the onion, and after 1 month of suffering, you'll feel better. Oh, after 3 months of suffering, you'll feel better. Oh, well, if you're not feeling better yet, it's probably because your mitochondria haven't kicked on. There's always some BS theory, if I'm being honest, as to why you should keep entrenching yourself in the dogma. And what's sad is we'll see people like this at the clinic, and not to say that we have all the answers, but it's like, geez, Mary Sue, you were feeling not well, so you went on a low carb diet and that stopped your bloating, but now you're not sleeping. You haven't had a period in 4 months and you have depression. And that's been maintaining for the past 6 months while you've been doing this diet. You also noticed one time you went on vacation to Cancun, said F it to your diet, ate a lot more carbs. Your period came back for 1 month. Your hair stopped falling out. You had better energy and you slept better. It's like, how hard does it have to be? Like, you're too low carb, but someone in authority hasn't yet told you that. And because you've been plugging into I'm just using low carb as one example. I'm not trying to pick on low carb specifically, but it's sad when we see this sort of stuff at the clinic. You didn't have to bang your head against a low carb wall forever. And to your point, camp, no camp, when you have a lot of the gurus out there just proclaiming the one thing as the one size fits all, it can harm people because they start thinking, well, I've got to follow this one dietary ideology, even if, like in Mary Sue's case, is clearly not working for me. So yeah, I think we're much better off having these conversations in a, I don't want to say a nuanced perspective, because I feel like that term is so overused now. But just letting people know there's a few different diets on offer, and you should spend a stint experimenting with the one. And if it doesn't help you, then move to the other. And after only a few months, you can find what dietary camp you feel best in. And this is the first section of the action plan in Healthy Gut, Healthy You, which is just giving people kind of a bird's eye view on, here's the 3 or 4 diets that most people will fit into. We'll start here. We'll give each diet about a month. We'll tick through them. And then once we've got a signal of improvement, that's the diet that we're going to stay on. And then we're going to move forward sort of in this self-help protocol.
I like that. Yeah. Yeah. It is so nuanced. I think it's hard because people want to latch onto something, and then that's how you gain a following, and that's how you become successful.
Right.
And so I get it. I get why people do it, but then I'd rather do the slow and steady approach but it's less sexy. That's a problem, is you can't get people involved, right? So many people, they did get help from Carnivore MD because it was so simple, or Sean Baker, right? It's like, oh, he just like crushes meat. But so I don't know the solution. I guess make my film come out and then have it be some kind of thing that people understand, where it does make a lot of sense why different diets can work. I guess that's what we're trying to do, to skip ahead, is why different diets work that seem opposite, because we're following the same ancestral principles, or because we're embracing animal nutrition and avoiding processed foods, and then you can tweak it under this framework. I guess I'm just pitching my own stuff, Sapien, really. Sapien, which is like the whole framework that I'm guessing you'd use, or I know you use basically under your own name, right? It's just like, let's get the principles in order and then tweak it.
And, there's another wrinkle here, which is we're not exactly hunter-gatherers at modern day. There's a lot, obviously, that is genetically identical or similar, but the immune system and the microbiota, those form in the first 3 years of life. And now that we have vastly different environments here in any westernized country than free living hunter-gatherers do, that changes the ecosystem in the gut and the immune system in the gut. And so it's not to say that we can borrow everything blindly from the hunter-gatherer camp. And this is where I think we have to have a toggle where we have the framework on the one toggle, but then as a clinician, you're looking at what actually helps people and what doesn't. And this is where I think, if you're really an astute clinician, you'll pick these things up. I came from a paleo background, and there was a point in time when I thought a paleo diet was the only diet, and especially a moderate to lower carb paleo diet, was the only diet that people should be eating. It was the only one people would thrive on. And if people were eating things like rice and carbs, oh my God, all those carbs is going to cause diabetes, going to cause inflammation, going to lead to Alzheimer's because of this 1.5 diabetes with the, tau proteins in the plaques. And after a few years of seeing that help some people, but not help other people, I started experimenting with, this person is indicating that they felt better when they eat more potatoes, allowed in the paleo diet. What if we bring some rice in? Because she was, patient Mary Sue, again, let's say she's using that same name, said she feels more regular if she has some rice. I feel like it binds me. You'll hear that a lot as a clinician when it comes to rice. All right, we'll have some more rice. And what happens? Their bowels are more regular and she's sleeping better. So you see one case like that, you kind of make a mental note, and you see another similar case a month later, and hey, Janet, why don't we have you try making some white rice and integrating that in your diet? Let's follow up in a few weeks and see how you do. What do you know? Yeah, my bowels are more regular and I'm sleeping better again. So you're right. So you start seeing those things, and then you kind of have that at some point in the forefront of your mind, where now when people come in, you're looking for this cast of symptoms that indicate they're too low carb. And that's how, as a clinician, you find your way out of your blind spots, because your patients really teach you these things. And this is why I get frustrated with the health gurus who aren't really operating in a clinical practice. Many kind of masquerade like they do, but some don't, or some do, but it's all about my protocol, or you're doing it wrong, so get out of here, sort of thing. And that's a real lost opportunity, because then as a clinician, you're not learning.
No, that's exactly right. And I've tried to do the same thing, even though I don't work with that many people. And I work with Dr. Gary, and we do some sapien stuff, but I have seen a lot of different things and changed my mind. So I think I went on the same journey as you. And then I started, even the white rice is a great example. I actually just had a barbecue yesterday here at my pool in Austin, and I made white rice cooked in bone broth and some mushrooms and onions mixed in, and everyone loved it. And, people are like, I think they were previously kind of carnivore people, and someone brought fruit, and we're kind of just, people are evolving. It's,
where have we gotten to where bringing fruit to a party is like a risque thing?
Oh man. Yeah. It's like this wild person. But no one brought kale. I'll tell you that. No one brought like spinach and kale. That's still, right. I'm still not into that. Well, I have my own sort of oxalate story. I got caught up in the juice, or the like kale spinach shakes. I think I did have some oxalate problems. So actually I do want to wrap back around on some things that we mentioned, because I think there's a difference, and there's a lot of context. There's always a lot of context, obviously, with this. And so we mentioned grains, gluten, we mentioned dairy, and then I guess we'll go to the gluten, oxalate foods, stuff like that, cruciferous vegetables, spinach. But sure. I'll start with grains. So there is a difference, and white rice is a good, clean grain. But then there's, I don't know what your take on it, especially the U.S. grains compared to Europe. And some people say, oh, I can eat it in Europe. And then we're bringing in monocropped, glyphosate stuff. We're talking about the different strains, all this, and the level of processing. So let's start with grains.
Well, as it pertains to Europe versus the US, that's not something that I've looked into regarding, and actually believe that we wanted to do a review on this a few years back, but I don't believe there was enough comparative data looking at outcomes with one population of grains versus the other. It is possible that we missed something. It could be that the grains themselves are different, definitely. And I've heard that, but more so anecdotally, that, there's more gluten in the grains, or they're more processed, or there's more pesticides. But I've learned that stuff you hear through the grapevine can be notoriously inaccurate. So unless I read it from the primary literature, I tend to take pause with how quickly I embody that position. But with grains, I haven't really done a deep dive on this, other than the paper I was referring to earlier looked at 1,200 patients. It was probably the best paper published on the prevalence of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Now, this was an Italian group at University of Bologna. I believe the primary author's name there was Volta. And this paper found about a 3% prevalence of gluten sensitivity. Now, the ranges, like I said earlier, go from about 0.6 to 6% of the population. So maybe that increase from 3% in this Italian-based study to 6% might account for some of the US data. But clearly there's something there. What I see, and what I grapple with more so for people, is the cohort of individuals who've gone too far in the other direction, where now they're cutting so much stuff out of their diet. They're so compliant with their healthcare that they can actually eat their way into undereating or orthorexia or fear of food. And so, for me, what I try to do is improve their gut health via some of the non-diet tools, because most people are already on a pretty good diet at baseline, and then help them to reintroduce their diet to find what's that?
They come to see you.
Right. They come to see me because I think they've exhausted diet.
Yeah. And so, sorry, I just wanted to make sure you weren't saying like most of America. Just the people that come to see you are already on a pretty good diet.
Right. Yeah. No. Sorry. So that's exactly what I was saying. Is that the people who come to see me usually have done a good job with their diet at baseline. So I don't really have strong thoughts about grains. I think it's a good idea to try cutting them out and then bring them back in and establish what your tolerance is. In terms of a fervent debate, I think we can find evidence that grains are health promoting and also evidence that grains can be problematic for people. And so from there, I don't really get too caught up in the nuances of the debate, but I rather help the individual determine where they fall in that range of data. For some people, very deleterious. For some people, health promoting, and that's kind of where I focus. And the way that you do that is really you try to reduce all the symptomatic noise, and this is where things like probiotics or antimicrobials or other gut healing interventions can improve the health of the gut, reduce some of the background up and down in the symptoms, and then they have a more consistent symptomatic baseline from which they can introduce the foods and see, I felt better, I felt worse, I felt no different, and be confident in the reintroduction experiment that they run.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the Weston Price approach, or I have a Dr. Bill Schindler come on and talk about the proper preparation of grains, like the slow fermenting, stuff like that. And I think that's a whole nother discussion. I think also there's a mental side. I think a lot of people which is hard to even study, which is a lot of people go carnivore because they have such strong food addictions to certain things. And they say, if I had a slice of bread, I'd be eating cake and donuts for the next week. So I do appreciate some of that. I think people probably need to do some work otherwise on their life, if it's mental stuff, or maybe fix their gut health in other ways with that. So they don't,
and some people have a tendency to get addicted to certain foods. And certainly if you notice you're someone who tends toward addiction to a certain food when eating it, then you probably shouldn't eat it. Although, at least from what I've seen, some fasting can really help reset runaway cravings. And so I think there's kind of a middle ground where people with some intermittent fasting, or maybe doing like a 1 meal a day protocol. I like doing this, or advising people to do this 1 day per week, can be helpful to keep their satiation mechanisms, if you will, healthy, and prevent them from kind of the quicksand of, for some people, carbs can be quicksand. For some people, healthy fat can also be quicksand. And it's something I fell into, where I was eating half a block of raw cheese every night. It's like, geez, there's, 1,500 calories that went down that. And,
Yeah, no, I like that. I like doing that. Yeah. Once in a while, try to do a 24-hour fast, or just OMAD's a good intervention in general. I've had a lot of people have great success on that, but then try to I think two meals a day is great. Certainly depends on what your goals are. If you're trying to put on muscle or you're trying to lose fat, dairy, it's good that you brought up dairy, because I want to talk about that for a second, because I think that is nuance as well. With, again, to the Weston Price stuff, it's just like raw dairy. There's a big difference in dairy. You could get Kraft singles, or you could get like a good raw cheese from the farmer's market.
Yeah. Stay away from Kraft singles for sure. But something else that's interesting about dairy. So yes, fully agree that the first thing that we want to do is use a minimally processed, high quality dairy. Definitely. There's been a number of clinical trials, even now summarized in a meta-analysis, which is a summary of clinical trials. So if you want to get a good representation of what a body of evidence says, look at a meta-analysis, because this may summarize 10 or 20 clinical trials. And there have been a couple meta-analyses published now that have found that probiotics can improve lactose tolerance. And this might be because the sensitive lining of the intestines is where you secrete the lactase enzymes, and probiotics have been shown to help repair the lining of the gut. And so likely what happens is the probiotics repair the lining of the intestines where the lactase enzyme is made, and therefore lactose tolerance improves. And you'll see that with a number of food and in fact, this is one of the biggest things that we see at the clinic, is people coming in because they feel better after going really restrictive, and they want to be able to not do that and have a more normal diet. And one of the chief things that we help people with is healing their gut so they can expand their diet. So there's pretty good research and also anecdotal evidence supporting that if you heal your gut, your food tolerances should improve, including
that
dairy.
leads into next. That's great, because that leads into the next one, is the anti-nutrients. And so I've seen tons of people improve. Like you mentioned, lectins, as maybe it's not that important, but They could have cut out a lot of other things with the lectin-free diet. But okay, so we have lectins, we have oxalates, we have salicylates, we have all these different things. I'm kind of I'm looking at both sides. I know some people, they're just like the less the better, and that they can block nutrient absorption, or they're no matter what, they're going to cause some irritation. But then there's also this other side, which I think you're in, is that if you do have a healthy gut, you can digest these and they can be fine. Is that how, like, if you do have a healthy gut, then you should be able to tolerate these things?
Yeah. I mean, the healthier the gut, the more it can tolerate. Definitely. Yeah. And, the anti-nutrient argument is an interesting one in the sense that it's one thing to show a mechanism, but it's the other thing to show a clinically relevant, what's known as effect size, meaning food X is an anti-nutrient. Okay. Is it an anti-nutrient to 0.06% or is it an anti-nutrient to 6%? Do you see what I'm saying? And that's often, in fact, that's notoriously left out of a lot of guru messaging is here's what's convenient for my philosophy. But what I'm not going to do is be a diligent scientist and tell you, oh, by the way, while this sounds really interesting, the effect is actually infinitesimally small. In fact, it's so small as to be negligent. And gene testing is a good example of this. The obesity gene, and I credit Tommy Woods, or Dr. Tommy Woods, who did a presentation on this recently, and he actually published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, that the obesity gene has less of an impact on your body weight than if you poop or pee before you weigh yourself. So, taken out of context, you have the obesity gene. Oh my, right? Or understand, sorry, my sit-stand desk is going wonky on me today. It keeps raising without me touching the button. So without that context, people don't know how to interpret data. MTHFR is another good example. That marker does not seem to have any clinical meaning, although many in the field would tell you otherwise. So the effect size of these things is quite important. And maybe the goitrogens for thyroid health is one of the best examples. I know of no one and no good data that has shown that consumption of goitrogenic foods, these are the foods that block iodine, lead to hypothyroidism. In fact, there's more evidence showing that an excessive intake of iodine can lead to hypothyroidism than there is showing frank insufficiency. Now, sure, there are some populations that have frank iodine insufficiency, but if you look at multiple studies across the world, the clear trend in the data, not cherry picking just one point, but looking at the trend, excessive iodine intake seems to be more problematic for provoking hypothyroidism than does a insufficient intake. So how would it be then that foods that block iodine uptake are incredibly deleterious for one's health? Just as one example. So, this is where I think science can get people into trouble, because you can make what's known as a really specious argument out of factoids. Specious just meaning it's seemingly appealing, but it's not actually true. And probably fat makes you fat would be one of the best examples of that, right? It in theory seems so plausible, but then we learned, well, that actually may be the opposite of what is true. This happens all the time with, these tick for tack factoids. Feed your gut bacteria, have better gut health. Not true for a fair number of individuals. In fact, feeding your gut bacteria, like we talked about with the high FODMAP foods, may actually make you worse from a gut health perspective. So even though you could see a fancy chart that shows that inulin increases lactobacillus healthy, I mean, that flow chart of mechanism has to be put into a clinical trial and tested on humans. And then we'll see, oh boy, when we gave all these patients with IBS a lot of inulin, they crap themselves, right? They were going to the bathroom like 6 times, 7 times per day, and they complained of abdominal pain. So I guess the one distinction there I'd like to draw is there's a big difference between something causes a change in the body mechanism versus it has an appreciable clinical effect outcome. So with the phytonutrients, it's not something that I've seen, at least for the couple areas where we've looked into it to have a large bearing on someone's health, especially when taken in the context of if we improve someone's gut health, those foods won't irritate the gut and won't cause symptoms, and therefore people will be able to eat them and feel healthy and thrive.
Do you think there's a seasonality component, or like just our modern lifestyle is very different from the past? I kind of like this argument is that, well, I mentioned my problem with kale and spinach. If I was drinking that shake every single day for years, that's not ancestrally appropriate. But I think throughout history, yes, we had a huge variety of foods seasonally, but now we don't do that. So then would it be a problem like every day?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's a good practice to have some type of seasonal eating and or rotation of the foods that you eat, just as a hedge, because you hedge against developing intolerances, you hedge against developing insufficiencies, and you force yourself to not get this kind of, tunnel vision with the foods that you eat, which can be easy, or especially if you're busy. So yeah, I do think seasonality is a good built-in sort of safety function. And to the point of oxalates, there's been a handful of cases for which a low oxalate diet has been helpful, but in maybe 2 years, I can say 3 to 5 people for whom the low oxalate diet was helpful. And I'm not even sure if they had to go low oxalate per se, as opposed to if we just got them to eat more of a rotation diet and broaden out their foods, would we have gotten to the same endpoint? So yeah, I mean, there have been a couple instances, and for maybe 2 years, we were tracking urinary oxalates, and we'll still run this in some individuals. But interestingly, urinary oxalates and the response to oxalate diet, at least as I was able to tell, didn't have a high level of correlation between the two. So there may be something there to the oxalates, but to my earlier comment, if you're seeing this help 2 to 5 cases over a 2-year period, it's hard to say that that's something really substantial that we should be kind of, gearing into our healthcare recommendations. It's something that maybe you keep in the back of the toolkit and you consider every once in a while. But again, I'm not sure if it was the oxalates per se or just getting people off of a high volume of one certain food that may have just started to become problematic for them due to the antigenicity, perhaps, rather than the oxalates. Although I remain open on the oxalate piece, but I think it's a little bit of a question mark.
Yeah, well, I've had some specific things happen with oxalates, and I have a lot of people who message with me that have very specific things, and yeah, I don't know. I think all this stuff, studying people is hard. Well, using anecdotes is not good for one thing, but going back to your stuff about talking about all the studies you've looked at in the literature, meta-analysis, I mean, part of my thinking is that the studies we've done aren't great in general. Like, what do you think about the state of the nutrition studies that we do? Because I think it's great that you're using a lot of this hard data, but then I feel like it's limited a lot of the time. And that's how we end up with the food pyramid and saying saturated fat's bad. And you know what I mean? It's like a lot of the problems are from this bad nutritional data.
Right. Yeah, this is a great point. And this is where I think having an ancestral framework that helps guide you with study design is really helpful, because you're right. If there's no study showing that an ancestral diet is helpful, and there's a bunch of studies looking at grains, you could falsely think that grains were the healthiest food to eat just because there's a paucity of research on the one and a plethora on the other. Mm-hmm. Fully agreed. And nutritional science, I do think, still suffers from quite a degree of bias. More so where I'm referring to is in the area of gut health. There's a lot of literature, and this is awesome for someone who's a clinician in this space as myself. There's over 1,000 clinical trials on probiotics as one example. So there's a real wealth of literature to pull from here. But you're right, there's not always a wealth or a evenness of the research. And this is something I also talk about in Healthy Gut, Healthy You, wherein there's less data on a paleo-like diet, but from some of the few trials that have compared paleo head-to-head to other diets, it's favored really well, in some cases, the paleo diet. So yes, we have to be careful to be what I call evidence-based, but not evidence-limited, meaning if there's not a clinical trial, just arbitrary example, saying that sleep is important for you, right? We shouldn't be dumb enough to think, well,
Yeah.
until I see a randomized control trial, I'm not going to recommend sleep. So,
Yeah.
you have to have some basis of physiology and ancestral health to guide you, so you can see where there's a gap in the evidence, so that you can be or avoid being evidence limited. And I think with nutrition science, yes, that's probably the area where there's the most bias in gut health. My primary focus. There's a lot of great data, and this is what's frustrating to me, is that even though there's clear data to answer a question, there's still controversy. One example would be, not to go too into the weeds here, but one quick example would be SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. There are still people saying that you should not use probiotics if you have SIBO, but there have been over 25 clinical trials that find that you can successfully treat SIBO with probiotics. In fact, even one study took a large group of patients with IBS, digestive symptoms, irritable bowel syndrome. Half of the patients were diagnosed with SIBO. The other half did not have SIBO. They were all given probiotics, and the group that had IBS plus SIBO responded better to the probiotics than the group who did not have SIBO. A 70% response rate to a 10% response rate. So there's data like this out there, right? That if you have SIBO, you have a 70% higher likelihood compared to the other group to improve. Actually, 60% delta, right? 10%, 70%. But people are still saying avoid probiotics if you have SIBO. So it's in areas like this where I get frustrated, because when we have the fortune of having data that can answer a question to a degree of certainty, and there's still contention. Nutrition science often cases a different story. And so I think the contentiousness is deserved there, because it's not exactly an apple to apple comparison. There's more research on one sort of camp, let's say, because there's been more funding there. And that's where we have to, try to weight the evidence accordingly to filter out for bias.
Well, basically what I've learned since I've been in this world is that nutrition science is almost impossible. You can have conflicting information everywhere. A lot of the stuff we've been saying today might be conflicting for different cases of different people. You could do opposite interventions and get good results. You could get bad results. So it's kind of like, just, you got to figure it out for yourself. You got to, really pay attention to what, makes you feel good and your symptoms and all that stuff.
Exactly. And that's why, back to my earlier point, we try to reduce as much symptomatic noise as we can, and then help use the person's presentation to guide, well, what diet seemingly, so from your information, would you do best on? Because there's a few different camps on offer. Let's figure out which camp you're going to do best in, and really make it about, the person is the primary item, not the philosophy.
I like that. Yeah, it's kind of camp, no camp. What about fiber though? Because fiber is a big one. I think it's going to be the same thing, where it could be this, it could be that. It could be very different with a person. My idea is fiber is definitely good if you're trying to eat a whole food. You want to eat the fiber with the food. That's what is one of the main things that makes a whole food good. It's in the fiber matrix, and it's slower to digest and all that stuff, instead of just getting a huge bolus of sugar, for one thing. But then I also have this idea that we think fiber is so magical because I think it's a proxy for someone who's just eating a better diet, right?
Yes.
It's like fiber is magical. I'm like, what if it's just because they're just eating a better diet? People eat more fiber, eat more whole foods. It's a proxy for less processed foods.
Yeah. You're going to love my book for when you get a chance to read it, because there's a whole section dedicated to this very question.
Okay.
And you're dead on. And this is something that I remember being at the PaleoFX. I believe this was 2018 or 2019. I was on their gut health panel for maybe 3 or 4 years in a row. And it was right when the boom in resistant starch and fiber was all the rage. And I'm coming from a clinical practice where we see a lot of digestive health issues. And so between that and my examination of the research literature, I knew that high fiber diets had a chance to really flare people, looking at clinical trials. But resistant starch, and the granules can get into intestines and feed the microbiome and feed your gut bugs and healthy bugs. And it was frustrating because this was taken from, stool sample studies trying to correlate microbiota findings upon a stool test and the health of an individual. But they weren't interventional trials, meaning if you see someone who's healthy and they have a diverse microbiota, it doesn't tell you how they got there. And it also doesn't mean that if you force feed their microbiota, you're going to make them healthy. And it was somewhat clearly obvious if you looked at the research studies that people with IBS and IBD, if you put them on a higher fiber or a higher prebiotic, either diet or supplement intake, it will help some, but you have a fairly decent margin of flaring in those individuals. So yes, fiber is not this panacea. There is some evidence that fiber can be helpful. It's probably most helpful when coming from a standard American garbage diet, as you intonated, and then going to a more kind of baseline healthy reference diet, which is kind of broad, but no matter what camp you go to within reason, if you're coming from the standard American diet, you're going to have a fiber intake increase. I mean, unless you're going carnivore, right? Mm-hmm. But from a terrible diet to almost any dietary change, your fiber level is going to increase. But it doesn't mean, to your point, that the fiber is responsible for the health benefits that are derived from whatever dietary change is undertaken. And then when you juxtapose that with the fact that interventional trials have been mixed, it's about a 50-50 split on does a higher fiber intake or fiber supplementation reduce colorectal cancer risk, or does it have no impact at all? And I go through a really clear kind of weighting of the evidence in one chapter of Healthy Gut, Healthy You. It was the most challenging chapter to write because there was 127 pages of research abstracts to go through and to kind of collate in terms of this supports fiber, this refutes fiber, here's the highest quality, here's the lowest quality. And once we collated all that data, it was pretty clear to see there's an even weighting of studies that show increasing fiber is health promoting as does not promote health. And when you understand that, you can then say, okay, then we're not going to pigeonhole you into a higher fiber diet because that's not really what the evidence shows. And there's ample evidence in this case to really answer that question. Now, there is one or two conditions for which fiber seems to have the most benefit. And this is mainly constipation. And people probably heard this, that if you're constipated, upping your fiber intake can be helpful. And that is true for some. And there's definitely a signal there, both in the research and both clinically. However, ironically, for some people, a lower fiber diet, as in the lower FODMAP diet, actually can improve constipation. So it's one of those things where it's not like an either or. It's a let's experiment a little bit and see what works best for the individual. And it's also not super hard. It's just try one, give it a few weeks, reevaluate. If yes, helping, continue. If no helping, try the other. And then if neither one seems to make a difference, then it probably doesn't matter for you. And then you can move on.
Yeah. And I went to visit the Hadza. Paul Saladin was there too. And I just had to bring it up quickly because a lot of it is based on, we looked at hunter-gatherers and they had like supposedly the most fiber ever, or all this stuff like that. And I don't know. It's just, I
write about that. I write about that too. You're going to love the book because there's a bias, and I made this world map, and what you can see is there's three main data points where these studies were performed, and they're all equatorial. And we know that equatorial regions will have a higher carb and higher fiber diet as compared to the poles. So that's a good example of where we can look at the research evidence, but we have to have a broader view on it and realize that that came from a biased sample. It came from an equatorial region that's going to have a higher fiber and higher carb intake. And so we shouldn't extrapolate that the Hadza microbiota should be forced into everyone. In fact, the Hadza had higher populations of this. It's a cousin of a bacteria called Narcaea. It's like a slightly more advanced bacteria. The organism, Methanobrevibacter smithii, helps the Hadza because it slows down transit and allows their microbiome to extract more nutrients and calories from the highly dense fibrous foods that they eat. But in Westerners who don't eat a lower calorie, higher fiber diet, guess what? Causes constipation and has been correlated to some extent with weight gain. So it's a great example of why we shouldn't be looking at a population totally different than us and saying, well, they're healthy, so let's use this one thing, their microbiome, and then try to force that upon Westerners who have a totally different lifestyle, environment, and microbiome.
It's such a good point. And there's so many other reasons they could have a good microbiome too. And I mean, I saw them eating the fibrous tuber stuff and spitting out the actual fiber. They weren't like actually eating these tubers, that the women were just chewing on them and spitting it out. But they also, they don't wash their hands. They don't have anything. They're just, they're living the life. They're out indoors. They're getting the sun.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you could also look, I mean, I interviewed a Sami guy up in the Arctic Circle. He's eating very low fiber diet, super healthy. Grandpa lived, super long, healthy. It's just so crazy when you already explained it. We can't box ourselves into these studying of one type of people. But okay, before we go, you start talking about probiotics. We got to finish off that because I'm wondering if you can get it all from food. I try to do it all with food, but then I also understand that our modern world is rough and sometimes we have to, get some other help.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on the person. If you're someone who has a good diet and you're in good health and you have no complaints, then sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, what have you, probably sufficient. When you look at the amount of probiotics in fermented foods as compared to a probiotic supplement, one capsule of probiotic usually equals, or let me say it this way, one serving of a probiotic food is usually 1/4 to 1/8 of a capsule of a probiotic. And you might be taking anywhere from 2 to 8 capsules of a probiotic per day. So there is a significant difference in the dose. But again, does that mean everyone needs a clinical dose? No. So if you're healthy, I would say focus on the probiotic rich foods, and that should suffice. But if you're someone with any digestive symptom, gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, abdominal pain, bloating, what have you, reflux, then you may want to consider, after getting your diet in place, kind of a step 2 intervention, a clinical trial on a probiotic. And the other thing here that's a little bit harder to cognize directly is, like I learned, if you have something like anxiety or depression, that could be driven by a problem in your gut. And there have been meta-analyses of probiotic trials finding them to be effective for depression and a weaker signal for anxiety. So even if you don't have digestive symptoms, but you have a health ailment, you may want to trial a good probiotic formula after you've gone through some kind of dietary and lifestyle changes as your step 1.
Yeah, well, the other stuff, man, we could open a whole can of worms, but I know you have to go. It's just all the other things that gut health relates to. So you mentioned depression, anxiety. How many diseases and how many ailments do you think start in the gut or are affected by the gut? All of them, maybe? Well, not all of them, because there's always.
Well, I think the most efficient way to look at this would be, how do we organize this into an order of operations? And I would say diet and lifestyle first, and then as a general heuristic, the next thing that should be pursued, kind of a healthcare journey, step 2, would be one's gut health, because you can see problems with joints, inflammation, skin, brain, sleep, metabolism, mood, thyroid. I mean, the list is pretty long and wide. Now, will you reverse frank type 2 diabetes? No. Will you reverse frank hypothyroidism? No. Will you see someone who needs significant less thyroid medication and has their symptoms go away? Yes. Will you see depression and anxiety clear in some cases? Yes. Will you see less joint pain, clearer skin, better energy, better sleep, better tolerance to stress? Yes. Is it a panacea? Nope. But again, thinking through probabilities, you want to make the thing that you do the highest likelihood to help you, right? You want to start with the highest likelihood, not the lowest likelihood. So to give you one biostats overlay, IBS affects about 15% of the US population. Hypothyroid affects about 1% of the population, which is why at the clinic we recommend optimizing gut health first before fine-tuning thyroid or going too far down the road, unless someone has frank hypothyroidism at baseline, and then we would address that in tandem. But the point I'm trying to articulate is, if someone's coming in and they have an ambiguous thyroid diagnosis and they have fatigue, depression, and constipation, it's 15 times more likely that could be driven by what's going on in their gut, loosely speaking, than it would be from this ambiguous thyroid problem. So to answer your question, the gut can affect many, many things, because the small intestine is where most nutrients are absorbed. It's the most aminoactive, meaning most prone to leaky gut. And it is also where the majority of your calories are absorbed. So the majority of calories, nutrients, and immune system reside in the small intestine. In fact, the largest density of immune cells in the entire body is in the small intestines. So that's a key area, right? Inflammation, nutrients, and calories all reside there. That's why we see such a broad impact. So I would say, if we're trying to give people a checklist to work down, step 1, diet and lifestyle. Step 2 would be gut health.
Well, it's so big. The small intestine is everything, and it's about what you eat. That's the most. I mean, that's what affects you the most. And I think part of our film is trying to get people to realize that. So it sounds like you're right on the same page. I have one last really quick question, because some people do the carnivore diet just to let the gut rest, and they have so many alleviation of symptoms. They feel great, all this stuff. But is that actually healing the gut, or do they need to go further? Because is there a difference between just resting the gut and actually healing and making improvements?
Yeah, great question. I would say that resting and healing are fairly synonymous, but you can't necessarily rest your way out of all problems. One of the ways I term this in Healthy Gut, Healthy You is, be careful not to force a dietary solution to a non-dietary problem. So in some cases, like my case, this is not common, but parasitic infection will not clear with diet, right? Now, will something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or a fungal overgrowth? Maybe. And starting with diet is where we should begin. But if upon reintroduction, the person is still struggling, that at least tells me that the rest wasn't sufficient to rebalance. Almost like a shoulder girdle or a rotator cuff injury, like we were saying earlier. Some time off and then go back to the gym. If you're still having pain and dysfunction, you probably need to check in with a PT and do some sort of rehab to balance it back out. So I look at carnivore in a sort of similar parallel analogy.
Okay. And then lastly, because I know you guys have some good supplements, probiotic stuff. So when food can't cut it, then let's go with some probiotics. And I guess they're not all created equal. So I know that you guys do some better, higher quality stuff.
Yeah, what we have been doing, after a number of years in clinical practice, I was using one formula or another or a third, and just trying to figure out what probiotic worked the best. And in tandem with this, you were seeing more and more research be done on really one of 3 different types of probiotics. You have your traditional blend of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species. This is something like your Visbiome or your VSL3. This is the type of probiotic that's been around the longest. There's hundreds of trials on this type of probiotic. The exact formulas differ, but what you're going to see is anywhere from 7 to 15 species, and it's going to be some predominated mix of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains. And pretty much all the trials, not everyone, but there's a super strong trend that these are helpful for a wide array of ailments. There's also Saccharomyces boulardii. This is a healthy fungus. The most well-known trade name is Florastor. Not a bacteria, actually a fungus, and can help, again, with a wide array of conditions. And so these are 2 formulas I was using and getting a sense for how they helped people. And then newer on the block are these kind of ancestrally named soil-based or spore-forming probiotics. Various Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus licheniformis, Bacillus clausii. Some of the formulas and trials use 1 species, some use 2, some use 3, some use 4. But also showing benefit for many of the same conditions that the Saccharomyces have and the lactobif blends have. So After a couple of years of using the one and then the other, I said, well, if someone's responding to the one, why not add the second one on top of it? And that seemed to work better than just one formula. So instead of sending someone home with one bottle, we sent them home with two. And once I was sure that was working, I said, well, why not add the third? And now you go home with three bottles, and we would call that probiotic triple therapy, hence three different bottles. And that's worked very well. And we've published some, or unofficially published some case studies on our website of people who had used one probiotic formula before, but really didn't see the needle move until they used all three together, hence the triple therapy. And so what we recently did about 6 months ago was we took 3 capsules from a lactobif blend, 2 capsules from Saccharomyces boulardii, and 2 capsules from the soil-based, mix them all together into a single serving stick that we call our probiotic triple therapy sticks. And this was just much more convenient than opening up 3 bottles, 3 capsules, 2 capsules, 2 capsules, and dosing that once or twice per day. And this has been really great to have, because with all of the benefits we see from probiotics, we want to exhaust and get as much out of this intervention as we can first before thinking about other therapies like antibiotics or herbal antimicrobials or immunoglobulins or some of the more kind of advanced therapies for the gut, which have their time and their place. But because probiotics can help reduce the severity and incidence of cold, including in children, can reduce seasonal allergy, can reduce the amount of stress one is under when exposed to stress, can reduce inflammatory markers, can reduce testosterone in women with PCOS, can improve cognition in those with mild cognitive impairment, can reduce inflammation and inflammatory bowel disease, can reduce IBS, can reduce leaky gut, because all these things, we want to try to get as much out of probiotics as possible because they're relatively cheap, they're very safe, and they have multiple benefits. So that's what we're doing with probiotics. It's a little bit different in terms of using the 3 different formulas together in that triple therapy application.
Well, it's great. I'll put a link in the show notes.
If we can defer to the show notes for that just to make sure, yeah, that would be great.
All right. Well, let's do it. I think it'll be great for people to try it out. I want to try it out, actually, because I've been doing my thing with, just trying to eat those foods, but I'm wondering if I can do better with, some actual supplements and go to the next level. So, man, I'll let you get out of here. Thanks so much for coming on. And maybe we can have a round 2 if we have any more details we can get into later or after I try some of the products and stuff like that.
Yeah, let's do it. And we can do it in person. I have a pretty nifty mobile setup that we can go to a coffee shop or something like that and kind of get out of the office. So if you want to take me up on that, we can do a round 2 in person.
I'd love that. Let's do it. And I have some more questions, so we'll get to those later.
Sweet. All right. Well, until then, thank you so much.
Okay,
It's been a lot of fun.
Take care.
All right. Thanks.